Can you tell us a bit more about how the pieces we are performing this term fit in with the history of Bach's B minor Mass?
Yeah, certainly. It's worth saying at the start that one of the reasons for doing this programme is that 1723 marked Bach's appointment to his final post as cantor at Leipzig. And the first 5 years or so of that period, Bach spent a lot of his time writing whole cycles of cantatas appropriate for all the Sundays and feast days in the church year. So by the end of that initial period in the 1720s, Bach had written over 200 cantatas which now survive. So it seemed appropriate 300 years on to celebrate in 2023 that legacy of over 200 marvellous works that you don't hear performed live very often. So we're taking 3 of the cantatas that provided material for the B minor Mass. The earliest one is Cantata 12, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Zagen, which provided the source for the Crucifixus in the B minor Mass. And interesting, this is the earliest material that Bach drew on. It was performed in April 1714 in Weimar, where Bach was working at the court. And when Bach adapted it for the Crucifixus, he just used the first section as the Crucifixus. The cantata has a middle section, which is more lively actually, and a faster triple time section, and then goes back and repeats the whole of the first section of the Da Capo. For the Crucifixus, Bach ends at the Et Sepultus Est, and then you have the big contrast with Yet Resurrexit and the blaze of D major with the trumpets coming in. So it's a very different context, although the idea of the text and the lamenting and weeping is very much the same. In Cantata 29, Bach provided the original source for the Gratias chorus from the B minor Mass, which comes back at the very end of the movement as the Dona Nobis Pacem. So this is the chorus which gradually builds up with trumpets and timps at the final stages of the fugal subject, and has a real cumulative effect. And interestingly, the words of the German text in the cantata, glorifying God, and the Latin text are very similar, and that's probably why Bach borrowed it. But it was originally written to celebrate the inauguration of the town council at Leipzig, so a rather different context, town council and God, but there you go. And that probably was used from an earlier source as well, as was the opening chorus of Cantata 11, the Ascension Oratorio, it's also often called, which provides material which comes back as the Agnus Dei in the B minor Mass, the marvellous alto aria right at the end of the work, and Bach follows the opening chorus in the cantata, number 11, with a version of the alto aria, which probably itself was based on an earlier version too, because those two arias are rather different, and the aria in the B minor Mass is actually a simpler version than in the cantata, and that's very unusual, which suggests that that was probably drawn from an earlier source. So there's a whole kind of host of borrowings there between the different works, which is typical of that period, because composers often borrowed from both their own music and indeed from the music of other composers as well. And so Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, Scarlatti, all the big names in the 18th century borrowed material all the time, and there was no copyright in those days to prevent them doing that. So it was all part of the art of composition at that period.
And do you think that's partly to do with the amount of work that they had to produce, that they were commissioned to produce by their sponsors?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think of Bach having to provide a new cantata every week, it's not surprising that he drew on other material, in just the same way as you have composers like Scarlatti or Vivaldi writing umpteen operas. And again, they used material and often borrowed material from works that were performed in other cities, so that the audience, say in Venice, wouldn't have heard a work that had been performed in Florence or in Germany or somewhere else. So they were adept at making the most of material and providing that demand for new music, which was very much what the audiences in the 18th century wanted, compared with nowadays, where if you put on a new work in a programme, you're guaranteed an empty concert hall. Whereas in those days, it was very much the new music that was often in demand by the public.
Oh, fantastic.